The mattress was too soft. Feathers, goose down, heavy silk, it felt like drowning. Nora lay stiffly under the canopy, listening to the man beside her breathe. He was a stranger in the dark, despite the fact that he employed her by day. The mattress shifted. A heavy arm pinned her waist. "No one can know you sleep in my bed," the Duke whispered against her bare shoulder, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You're still the governess." The heat of his skin against her spine was a localized fire, but the rest of the vast bedchamber belonged to the winter draft. Nora did not nod. She did not murmur an agreement. She merely waited until Alistair's breathing deepened into the slow, rhythmic drag of genuine sleep, carefully lifted his heavy, muscle-dense arm from her waist, and slipped out of the bed. The floorboards were glacial. Her bare feet recoiled at the shock of the polished oak, but she forced herself to stand flat. In the dark, the Duke of Rothmere's bedchamber was a cavern of shadows and privilege. It smelled of beeswax, stale claret, and the sharp piney scent of the shaving soap he used. A discarded velvet waistcoat lay draped over a chair like a slaughtered beast. Nora found her plain linen nightshift crumpled near the footboard. She pulled it over her head. The fabric, washed too many times with harsh lye, scratched against her breasts and shoulders. A stark, immediate reminder of exactly who she was. She did not look back at the bed. There was no point. The man tangled in the embroidered sheets was not hers to observe, let alone keep. He was an employer who possessed a nocturnal weakness for the only woman in the house who didn't fawn over him. Nora patted out the side door, slipping through the servants' corridor before the first scullery maid had even thought to wake to stir the kitchen hearth. Her own room was 4 flights up, tucked under the eaves of the east wing. It was a miserable, cramped space that smelled perpetually of damp wool and old mice. By the time she reached it, her teeth were chattering so violently she had to bite her own tongue to keep quiet. She poured water from the ceramic pitcher into the wash basin. A thin layer of ice had formed on the top. She broke it with her knuckles. The sharp sting of the freezing water against her face and throat was necessary. It washed away the smell of his sweat, the memory of his heavy hands, and the lingering pathetic warmth that always tried to take root in her chest. She dressed mechanically. Corset pulled tight enough to enforce perfect posture, but not so tight she couldn't bend to retrieve dropped chalk. Thick gray stockings. The high-collared, drab-brown gown that functioned as her armor. It was an ugly garment, designed entirely to erase whatever youth or appeal she might naturally possess. She pinned her dark hair back until her scalp ached. At 7 o'clock precisely, Nora walked into the nursery. Penelope was already awake, sitting on the rug by the unlit grate, aggressively plucking the eyes out of a porcelain doll. The child was 8 years old, possessed her father's startling, pale gray eyes, and hadn't spoken a complete sentence in the 6 months since her mother died of a sudden fever. "Good morning, Penelope," Nora said, her voice crisp and entirely devoid of the coddling tone the previous nurses had employed. Penelope blinked, dropping the doll. She offered a slow, stiff nod. "Table," Nora instructed, pulling out a chair. "We are finishing the penmanship exercise from yesterday. If you smear the ink again, we will stay through the luncheon bell." The morning dragged. The nursery was bitterly cold until the parlor maid finally came up to light the fire at 9, leaving behind a bucket of cheap, smoky peat that stung the eyes. Nora sat beside Penelope, correcting her grip on the pen. The scratching of the nib against the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. It was a monotonous, grounding noise. It was real. At 10:30, the heavy oak door creaked open. Alistair Cavendish, the Duke of Rothmere, stepped into the room. He brought the scent of damp riding leathers and cold outdoor air with him. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered but lean, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from flint and left out to weather. He looked exhausted. The deep violet shadows under his eyes were prominent in the harsh morning light. Nora stood immediately, clasping her hands at her waist, dropping her gaze to the floorboards just past his scuffed riding boots. "Your Grace." "Miss Hayes," he replied. His voice was a flat baritone. It betrayed absolutely nothing. It was the exact same voice that had whispered against her bare skin hours ago, but stripped of all vulnerability. "How is she progressing?" Alistair asked, not looking at his daughter, but staring directly at the side of Nora's face. "Her penmanship improves, Your Grace," Nora said evenly. She forced herself to breathe at a normal pace. Her heart was beating a frantic, humiliating rhythm against her ribs, though her focus tends to drift by mid-morning. "See that it doesn't," he murmured. He finally glanced down at Penelope, who was staring fixedly at her inkwell, shrinking back into her chair. Alistair's jaw tightened. He looked at his daughter not with malice, but with a profound, helpless inadequacy. He didn't know what to do with the child, just as he didn't know what to do with his grief or his vast, empty house. "I require a list of the books you need for the next quarter," Alistair said, returning his attention to Nora. "Have it on my desk by evening." "Yes, Your Grace." He lingered for a fraction of a second longer than was polite. Nora kept her eyes firmly on his boots. She could see the mud caked on the heels. She remembered the way those long legs had tangled with hers. The contradiction made her feel physically ill. She swallowed hard, locking her knees. Then, without another word, he turned and strode out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The nursery suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Nora slowly exhaled, unclenching her hands. She sat back down beside Penelope, picked up a clean quill, and pointed to the parchment. "Again," she told the girl. Her voice was steady. It had to be. The arrangement had not begun with a seduction. There had been no lingering glances over the dinner table, no brushed hands in the hallways, no sudden torrential downpour trapping them together in a hunting cabin. Nora was too cynical for romance, and Alistair was too numb. It had started 3 weeks ago, on a mundane, freezing Tuesday night. Nora had been unable to sleep, her mind gnawing on a discrepancy in Penelope's behavior. The child had hoarded 3 dinner rolls in her pockets, a strange, squirrel-like anxiety that Nora couldn't decipher. Seeking a book on child psychology she recalled seeing in the main library, Nora had ventured downstairs at 2 a.m. She had worn her heavy wool shawl over her night shift, expecting the house to be deserted. She found the Duke sitting in the dark leather armchair by the dead hearth. He held a glass of untouched amber liquid. He hadn't noticed her at first. He was staring at the cold ashes with an expression of such hollow, crushing defeat that Nora had frozen in the doorway. He looked entirely broken. When he finally sensed her presence, he didn't demand to know why she was out of bed. He didn't shout. He just looked at her, his pale eyes catching the moonlight from the tall windows. "I cannot sleep in that room," he had said, his voice a hoarse rasp, not a command, not an explanation, a confession to the shadows. The quiet is deafening. Nora, practically to a fault, hadn't offered platitudes about his late wife or the nature of grief. She simply walked over, took the heavy glass from his loose grip, and set it on the side table. "Then do not sleep in it alone," she had replied. It was a staggering risk. It was grounds for immediate dismissal, for ruin. But Nora had seen a dying animal, and she knew the only thing that kept the cold at bay was friction. He had stood, towering over her, searching her unremarkable face for pity or ambition. Finding neither, he had offered his hand. They walked up the grand staircase in total silence. He didn't kiss her that night. He simply pulled her into the vast, overly soft bed, wrapped his arms around her with bone-bruising force, and buried his face in the space between her neck and shoulder. He slept like the dead. She had stayed awake, staring at the canopy, realizing she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Now, 3 weeks later, the physical intimacy had escalated, born of proximity and an unspoken, desperate need to feel alive in a house governed by ghosts. But the rules remained ironclad. They never spoke of it during the day. They never looked at each other when the staff was present. At 4 p.m, Nora sat in the servants' dining hall. The air was thick with the smell of boiled mutton and damp cabbage. She ate mechanically, keeping her eyes on her plate. while the chatter of the household staff swirled around her. "He's in a foul mood today," muttered Thomas, the head footman, tearing a chunk of bread. "Snapped at me for leaving the Morning Post on the wrong corner of the desk. He's been foul since her ladyship passed," Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, replied. She sat at the head of the long wooden table, her back rigidly straight. She was a woman comprised entirely of sharp angles and suspicion. "Though I'll say, he looks marginally less like a walking corpse these past few weeks. Perhaps the grief is finally breaking." Nora's fork paused for a fraction of a second before piercing a piece of boiled potato. She chewed slowly, tasting nothing. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the low murmur of the table. Nora looked up, meeting the housekeeper's dark, scrutinizing gaze. "Yes, Mrs. Gable?" "I found a hairpin on the carpet in the second-floor corridor this morning, near the master suite." Mrs. Gable placed a simple, unadorned iron pin on the wooden table. It clicked softly against the timber. "None of the maids use iron. They use brass. You use iron, do you not?" The dining hall went utterly silent. The clatter of cutlery ceased. Everyone was looking at her. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, suffocatingly hot. Nora looked at the hairpin. It was undeniably hers. She must have dropped it during her frantic, freezing retreat before dawn. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and bright, but she forced her face to remain a mask of mild confusion. She reached out and touched the pin with one finger. "I do," Nora said smoothly. "Penelope was quite distressed yesterday afternoon. She took off down the corridor and I had to chase her. I imagine it fell out then." She looked back up at Mrs. Gable, keeping her eyes wide and steady. "Thank you for returning it. I have so few left." Mrs. Gable stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Her eyes narrowed infinitesimally. She didn't believe the lie. Nora knew she didn't, but without proof, a housekeeper could not openly accuse the governess of sharing the Duke's bed. "See that you keep your hair secured, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Gable finally said, her tone dripping with quiet menace. "We maintain standards in this house." "Of course," Nora replied. She slipped the pin into her apron pocket, her fingers trembling slightly where no one could see them. The rest of the meal was an exercise in torture. Every scrape of a chair, every cough, felt like an accusation. Nora knew she was walking on the edge of a knife. The paranoia was corrosive. It ate at her concentration, turning her stomach to lead. She was a paid servant. If she was caught, Alistair would face momentary embarrassment among his peers. He would be fine. Nora would be thrown out into the street without a reference, her reputation destroyed. She would starve. And yet, as the clock struck 9 that evening and she finally retreated to her freezing attic room, she didn't lock her door. She sat on the edge of her lumpy, narrow mattress, staring at the frost creeping across the small window pane. Her room was so cold she could see her own breath pluming in the air. She waited. The logical, cynical part of her brain screamed at her to barricade the door, to refuse him if he came, to end the madness before Mrs. Gable found something more damning than a hairpin. But her hands remained folded in her lap. The memory of his heavy arm pinning her waist, the scent of his skin, the rare, rough heat of another human being against her own. It was a drug she hadn't known she was addicted to until she tasted it. At 1:45, the faint, deliberate creak of the floorboards outside her door sounded. 3 slow steps. A pause. Nora closed her eyes. She hated herself for the relief that washed over her. She stood up, wrapped her thin shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door to the shadows. He stood in the narrow doorway, his broad shoulders practically brushing the splintered door frame. He wore a heavy wool dressing gown, hastily tied, his bare feet planted on the drafty floorboards. He did not belong up here. The attic was a space designed to remind the servants of their insignificance. Sloped ceilings that forced a stoop, walls lined with peeling faded paper, and a permanent, inescapable chill. Alistair's presence in it felt entirely wrong. It was a collision of worlds that made Nora's stomach clench. He stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind him. The click of the cheap iron latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. "You shouldn't be here," Nora whispered. Her voice trembled, though whether from the freezing air or the sheer terrifying risk of his presence, she couldn't tell. "Mrs. Gable prowls the second-floor landing. If she comes up the servant stairs, she won't." His voice was a low, jagged scrape in the dark. He moved closer. The room was so small, he only had to take 2 strides before he was standing over her. "I checked the corridor. The house is dead." He reached out, his large hands finding her shoulders through the thin, threadbare shawl. His fingers were icy, but the palms were startlingly hot. He pulled her against him. The collision was not gentle. It was fueled by the same hollow, frantic energy that drove a starving man to tear at stale bread. Nora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to brace against his chest. But the moment she felt the steady, heavy thud of his heart beneath the wool of his gown, her resistance crumbled. She hated herself for it. She hated the immediate, pathetic yielding of her own spine. He walked her backward until her calves hit the edge of the narrow, lumpy mattress. They fell onto it together. The bed frame groaned, a sharp metallic screech of rusted springs that made them both freeze. Alistair went completely still, his weight pressing her down into the horsehair stuffing. They lay in the freezing dark, barely breathing, listening to the silence of the house. A minute passed. No footsteps sounded on the stairs. No doors opened below. Slowly, he exhaled, his breath a warm, damp rush against her collarbone. He didn't speak again. There was no room for words in the dark. He shifted, his movements urgent but tightly constrained by the fear of making another sound. It was an awkward, desperate scramble. His elbow knocked against the wash basin stand, making the ceramic pitcher rattle ominously. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, crude word that no duke would ever utter in a drawing room. He reached behind her head, wedging his broad hand between the flimsy wooden headboard and the plaster wall to muffle the inevitable rhythmic knocking. It wasn't a romance. It was an act of raw, necessary survival. The mattress pricked Nora's bare back through the thin sheet. The air in the room was so cold it burned the back of her throat, but where their skin touched, it was a suffocating, blinding heat. She dug her fingers into the heavy muscles of his back, anchoring herself to him, anchoring him to the earth. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged, bordering on a sob that he violently suppressed. He was using her to forget, and she was letting him, entirely because she was tired of being invisible. When it was over, the crushing reality of the attic rushed back in. The bed was too narrow for 2 people to lie comfortably. Alistair's legs hung off the edge. The cold began to seep back into their sweat-dampened skin, biting and immediate. He didn't linger. He couldn't. He sat up, running a hand roughly through his dark hair, the shadows hiding his expression. "I will leave the door to the east stairwell unlocked tomorrow night," he murmured, his voice returning to that flat, emotionless baritone. He was already retreating, already rebuilding the walls. "Do not come up the main passage." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied. The title tasted like ash in her mouth. He paused, his hand on the latch. He looked back at her, a shape in the gloom. For a second, Nora thought he might say something else, something human, but he merely opened the door and vanished into the corridor, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of beeswax and the lingering, humiliating warmth on her sheets. The next morning, the exhaustion sat in Nora's bones like lead. Her head ached behind her eyes as she stood by the nursery window, watching the frost melt sluggishly on the glass. The chalk dust on her fingers felt gritty. "Look." Nora turned. Penelope was standing by the small wooden table, holding up her slate. It was the first time the child had initiated a conversation in weeks. Nora walked over, her posture rigid, pushing down the bone-deep weariness. She looked at the slate. It wasn't a penmanship exercise. It was a crude chalk drawing of a house. But there were no windows. The doors were scribbled over with heavy dark slashes, trapping whatever was inside. It's closed, Penelope whispered. Her pale gray eyes, so agonizingly like her father's, looked up at Nora. Nobody can get out. Nora's chest tightened. She recognized the crushing weight in the child's voice. It was the exact same weight that had driven the Duke to the attic the night before. Grief was rotting the house from the inside out, consuming the father and suffocating the daughter. Nora did not pat the girl's head. She did not offer a soft, useless smile. She took the damp cloth from the edge of the desk, wiped a single clean square through the heavy chalk lines of the door, and handed the slate back. "Then we make a draft," Nora said firmly. "Even closed houses need air, Penelope, or the wood rots." Penelope stared at the clean square of slate for a long time. Slowly, she picked up her piece of chalk. She didn't draw a door, but she carefully traced the outline of the opening. It was a minuscule, fragile victory. Nora sat back down, the ache in her head fading into a dull throb. She had survived another night, and she had survived the morning. That had to be enough. By Thursday afternoon, the illusion of separation began to fracture. The physical toll of the late nights and the unyielding, frigid mornings was compounding, fraying Nora's normally ironclad composure. She caught herself staring at the grain of the nursery floorboards for minutes at a time, her mind completely blank, her body vibrating with a low-grade constant fatigue. The summons came at 2 o'clock. A maid arrived at the nursery door with a crisp instruction. The Duke required the governess to bring the ledgers for Penelope's new winter wardrobe to the main library. Nora smoothed her drab brown skirt, checked that her hair was severely pinned, and picked up the leather-bound book. Her heart, predictably, began its heavy, traitorous thumping against her ribs. She hated the physical reaction. She hated the way her body betrayed her intellect. The library was located in the West Wing, a sprawling, magnificent room lined with mahogany shelves and smelling of old paper, rich leather, and expensive cigar smoke. As Nora approached the heavy double doors, she heard voices. A guest. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass knob. She should wait. A governess did not interrupt a duke when he was entertaining peers, but the summons had been immediate. Gritting her teeth, she pushed the door open, keeping her gaze appropriately lowered. The heat of the room hit her like a physical blow. A massive fire roared in the marble hearth, radiating a luxurious, wasteful warmth that made the damp chill of her attic seem like a different planet. 2 men sat in the deep leather armchairs by the fire. Alistair, and an older, thickly built man with a ruddy complexion and an aggressively tailored tweed suit. Lord Townsend, a neighbor who owned the sprawling estate to the south. "Ah," Townsend rumbled, his voice thick with port and self-satisfaction. "The domestic machinery grinds on." "Miss Hayes," Alistair said. His voice was cool, distant, entirely aristocratic. "The ledgers." Nora walked forward. She felt exposed, ugly, and entirely out of place in her coarse wool dress against the backdrop of silk rugs and velvet drapery. She approached the small table between the men, keeping her eyes fixed on the silver tray holding a decanter of brandy. "Right here, Your Grace," she murmured, placing the ledger down. As she pulled her hand back, Townsend leaned forward, his watery blue eyes trailing slowly up her arm, lingering on the line of her corset, before finally resting on her face. It was a distinctly assessing look, the kind a man gives a horse before checking its teeth. "A new addition to the staff, Rothmere?" Townsend asked, taking a drag from his cigar. The smoke curled toward Nora, thick and cloying. "Rather severe, isn't she? But I suppose one needs a firm hand with a child who has difficulties." Nora's jaw clenched so hard, her teeth ached. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, staring at the spine of a book on a nearby shelf. She waited for Alistair to speak. She didn't expect him to defend her honor like a knight in a storybook. She wasn't an idiot. But some small, pathetic part of her waited for a subtle deflection, a shift in tone, a minor acknowledgement that she was a human being he had touched only hours ago. Alistair reached forward and poured himself another measure of brandy. The crystal clinked against the glass. He didn't look at Nora. "She is efficient," Alistair replied, his tone as flat and indifferent as a stone skipping across ice. "And she keeps Penelope quiet. That is the entirety of her function." The words landed perfectly. They were exactly what a duke should say to a peer about a servant. They were protective of his own reputation, dismissing her importance utterly, turning her back into a piece of furniture. "Indeed," Townsend chuckled, losing interest and leaning back. "Well, as I was saying about the grain tariffs—" "You may go, Miss Hayes," Alistair said, waving a hand dismissively. He still didn't look at her. "Yes, Your Grace." Nora turned and walked out of the library. Her steps were even, measured, entirely professional. She closed the heavy mahogany doors behind her without a sound. She stood in the empty corridor for a long time. The grand portraits of Alistair's ancestors stared down at her from the silk-lined walls. The silence of the house pressed in, heavy and suffocating. That is the entirety of her function. The words echoed in her skull. It wasn't a betrayal. A man cannot betray someone he has made no promises to. Alistair had never lied to her. He had never spoken of affection, or a future, or anything beyond the desperate anonymous friction in the dark. He had stated a simple, undeniable fact. She was the governess. She was a vessel for his grief, a temporary, convenient warmth. The realization didn't break her heart. Her heart had hardened years ago, but it snapped something else. It snapped the fragile, dangerous thread of illusion she had allowed herself to weave. She was risking her livelihood, her reputation, her very survival, for a man who would dismiss her to a drunken lord without a flinch. She walked back up the servant stairs, her hands shaking, not from cold, but from a sudden, fierce anger at her own stupidity. She had allowed loneliness to make her reckless. That night, the house settled into its usual, oppressive silence. The frost crept up the window pane of her attic room. Nora sat on the edge of the narrow, lumpy bed, wearing her heavy wool shawl. She looked at the door. At 1:45, the faint, deliberate creak of the floorboards sounded outside. 3 slow steps. A pause. Nora stood up. She didn't walk to the latch to open it. She took the heavy rusted iron key that sat on her wash basin stand, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud metallic clack that echoed violently in the small space. She stepped back. On the other side of the door, the heavy breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Nora stood in the freezing dark, wrapping her arms around her own chest, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for him to walk away. He did not knock. A man accustomed to the world parting for him did not rattle a locked door in the dark like a beggar. Nora stood frozen against the peeling plaster, her bare feet numb on the floorboards. She heard the sharp, sudden intake of his breath through the thin wood, a sound of profound, jarring shock. For 30 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The silence in the attic was heavy, thick with the unsaid. Then the floorboards groaned. One slow, heavy footstep, then another, retreating down the narrow corridor. The sound of his descent faded into the cavernous belly of the house. Nora exhaled, a ragged, ugly sound. She crawled into the narrow bed, pulling the scratching wool blanket to her chin. She did not sleep. She lay perfectly still, tracing the water stains on the ceiling until the gray, weak light of dawn bled through the frost on the window pane. The morning routine was a mechanical exercise in survival. She pinned her hair tighter than usual, the iron grip scraping her scalp. Her reflection in the spotted mirror was entirely unremarkable. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. Her mouth was set in a hard, uncompromising line. She expected to be dismissed by noon. A duke denied access to anything he desired, especially a servant, would not tolerate the humiliation of her continued presence. She began mentally calculating the meager coins tied in a handkerchief at the bottom of her trunk. It would buy her 2 weeks in a cheap boarding house in London, 3 if she ate only porridge. She walked into the nursery at 7 o'clock. Penelope was already at the table, her small hands neatly folded over a blank slate. "Good morning, Penelope," Nora said, her voice betraying none of the jagged panic tearing at her stomach. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," the child replied. It was a whisper, thin as paper, but it was a greeting. "History today?" Nora instructed, pulling the heavy, dusty volume from the shelf. "We will begin with the Tudor succession." By 10 o'clock, the anticipated knock came. Nora's fingers tightened on the spine of the history book. She stood slowly, squaring her shoulders. But it was not the formidable Mrs. Gable arriving to deliver her severance. The door swung open, and Alistair stepped in. He was dressed for riding, impeccably tailored in dark wool, his boots polished to a vicious shine. He did not look exhausted today. He looked dangerous. The hollow, desperate man from the attic had been entirely replaced by the Duke of Rothmere. His jaw was set like a vice. He closed the nursery door behind him with a quiet, definitive click that made the hair on Nora's arm stand up. "Your Grace," Nora murmured, dropping her gaze to the floorboards. "Miss Hayes." He walked slowly into the room, the scent of sharp leather and cold air following him. He stopped beside the instructional table. He did not look at Penelope. He looked directly at the top of Nora's bowed head. "I understand there has been a change in the curriculum," Alistair said. His voice was low, smooth, and laced with absolute frost. Nora looked up, meeting his pale slate-gray eyes. The clash was silent, but violent. She refused to blink. "We are focusing on history this morning, Your Grace. Geography proved difficult yesterday." "Did it?" He took a step closer. The heat radiating off his large frame was an aggressive physical presence. "I was under the impression the previous arrangement was functioning perfectly. Circumstances change," Nora replied evenly. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, but she forced her hands to remain loosely clasped at her waist. "One must adapt to the reality of the house, Your Grace. Continuing with a flawed method benefits no one." A muscle feathered in Alistair's jaw. He understood exactly what she was saying. He leaned down, placing one large leather-gloved hand flat on the wooden table, right next to Penelope's slate. The child flinched, shrinking back into her chair, her eyes darting nervously between her father and her governess. Alistair noticed the flinch. He froze, his gaze snapping down to his daughter. The anger in his posture dissolved, replaced instantly by a stark, suffocating guilt. He pulled his hand back as if the wood had burned him. "The library ledgers," he said abruptly, his voice stripping itself of the dangerous edge, leaving behind a brittle emptiness. He looked back at Nora. "You made an error in the sum on the final page. You will come to my study at 4 o'clock to correct it." It was an order. It was a test. He was reasserting his authority, dragging her onto his territory in the cold light of day. "I will correct the error here, Your Grace, and send the ledger down with a footman," Nora countered. It was an appalling breach of protocol. A servant did not dictate terms to a master. Alistair stared at her. The silence stretched, thin and humming with tension. He was a man who could ruin her with a single word to his steward. Nora braced herself for the dismissal, her spine rigid against the drafty air of the room. Instead of shouting, Alistair gave a sharp, incredulous huff of breath that was almost a laugh, though entirely devoid of humor. He looked at her not with aristocratic disdain, but with a frustrated, feral intensity. 4 o'clock, Miss Hayes," he repeated softly. He turned on his heel and strode out of the nursery. The door shut firmly behind him. Nora slowly exhaled, her knees trembling slightly beneath her heavy wool skirt. She sat down next to Penelope, picking up a piece of chalk. She had won the skirmish, but the war had merely shifted battlegrounds. By 3 o'clock, Mrs. Gable's petty tyranny manifested. The housekeeper intercepted Nora in the second-floor corridor, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. "Miss Hayes, Since you seem to have an excess of idle time between the child's lessons, you will inventory the linens in the West Wing stores. Today, the maids are occupied. The West Wing stores were located at the far end of the corridor, directly adjacent to the master suite. It was a calculated, vicious assignment. Mrs. Gable was waiting to see if Nora would invent an excuse to avoid the area, or worse, if she would linger near the Duke's quarters. "Of course, Mrs. Gable," Nora replied, keeping her expression bland. She took the ring of heavy brass keys from the housekeeper's hand. The metal was cold. The linen closet was not a closet. It was a long, windowless room lined from floor to ceiling with deep oak shelves. It smelled overpoweringly of dried lavender, starch, and old dust. Nora lit a single oil lamp and set to work. She dragged a heavy wooden stool to the far corner, counting the thick, embroidered winter quilts. The work was mindless, physical, and a welcome distraction from the looming dread of 4 o'clock. At 3:45, the heavy door of the linen room clicked shut. Nora spun around, nearly knocking the oil lamp off the shelf. Alistair stood just inside the room. He had discarded his riding coat and wore only a crisp white shirt, the collar unbuttoned, and a dark waistcoat. The sheer size of him made the cramped room feel suddenly claustrophobic. He leaned back against the heavy wooden door, deliberately turning the iron key in the lock behind his back. The clack echoed loudly in the confined space. "You did not come to the study," he said. The flat baritone was gone. His voice was rough, unpolished. "It is only 1:15, Nora said, stepping back until her spine hit the edge of a shelf. "And I have been tasked by Mrs. Gable to inventory this room. I cannot leave until it is finished." "Mrs. Gable does not employ you. I do." He pushed off the door and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped inches from her. The smell of dried lavender was instantly overpowered by the scent of him, soap, wool, and the faint sharp tang of brandy. Nora tilted her chin up, refusing to shrink. "And as my employer, you should know better than to corner a servant in a locked room," Nora said, her voice low and furious. "If a maid tries that door, I will be out on the street by nightfall. But you will merely have to endure an uncomfortable conversation with your steward. Do not play the frightened maid with me, Nora. It doesn't suit you." It was the first time he had ever used her Christian name. It felt like a physical violation, tearing away the last protective layer of their formal arrangement. "I'm not playing anything," she snapped, the tightly coiled anger finally breaking free. "I am surviving. Something you clearly know nothing about, given how casually you treat the only livelihood I have." Alistair reached out, his hand gripping her upper arm. His fingers dug into the coarse wool of her sleeve. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was absolute. "Why did you lock the door?" "Because I heard you in the library yesterday," she hissed, trying to wrench her arm away, but he held fast. "I heard exactly what you think of me. That is the entirety of her function." Alistair flinched. The grip on her arm loosened slightly, his pale eyes widening in the dim light of the oil lamp. He looked genuinely rattled. "You were eavesdropping." "I was delivering the ledger you demanded," she corrected harshly, "and I received a very clear, very necessary reminder of my place in this house. I am a convenience, a warm body to keep the ghosts away until you find a suitable wife. That is your privilege as a duke, but it is my privilege to decide who enters my room. I was speaking to Townsend," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a desperate, urgent rasp. He stepped closer, crowding her against the linen shelves. "A man who gossips like a bored widow. What did you expect me to say? That my governess is the only reason I haven't put a pistol in my mouth to escape the silence in this damned house?" Nora's breath hitched. The raw, bleeding confession hung in the dusty air between them, completely upending the balance of power. She stared at the sharp lines of his face, seeing the cracks in the stone. "It doesn't matter what you say to him," Nora whispered, her anger turning to a heavy, suffocating ache. "It matters that it is true. I am just the governess." "Stop," he demanded, bringing his other hand up to cup her jaw. His palm was hot, his thumb rough against her cheekbone. He didn't kiss her. It was a gesture of frantic possession, not romance. Do you think I care about the title when the door is shut? Do you think I feel like a duke when I'm shivering in your bed? But the door opens, Alistair, she breathed, dropping the title. The reality of his name felt heavy on her tongue. The sun comes up, and I have to sit in the dining hall and pray Mrs. Gable hasn't noticed my hair's out of place. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving steadily toward the end of the hall, toward the linen room. Nora froze, the blood draining from her face. Alistair's hand dropped from her jaw instantly. He took a swift step back, putting 3 feet of polite, terrifying distance between them. The intimacy evaporated, replaced by cold, hard panic. The handle of the heavy oak door rattled. The heavy brass handle rattled again, louder this time, followed by the sharp, impatient rapping of knuckles against the thick oak. "Miss Hayes." Mrs. Gable's voice bled through the wood, muffled but unmistakably rigid with suspicion. "The door appears to be stuck. Are you inside?" Nora's lungs seized. The air in the claustrophobic linen room suddenly tasted of ash and copper. She took a blind step backward, her shoulder colliding hard with the edge of a shelf. A stack of starched pillowcases toppled, hitting the floorboards with a soft, sickening thud. Alistair's reaction was instantaneous and entirely devoid of panic. The frantic, bleeding man who had just laid his soul bare vanished, swallowed whole by the Duke of Rothmere. He held a finger to his lips, a sharp, commanding gesture for absolute silence. He smoothly untangled the heavy iron key from his fingers, slipping it into his waistcoat pocket. "Miss Hayes?" Mrs. Gable called again. The handle twisted violently. "Stand clear of the latch." Alistair didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the door, his movements silent despite his heavy leather boots. He reached out, grasped the brass handle from the inside, and yanked the heavy oak door inward with enough force to make the hinges shriek. Mrs. Gable stood in the corridor, her hand raised to knock again. The housekeeper froze, the color draining from her pinched face so rapidly she appeared sickly under the gaslight. Her dark eyes darted from the towering figure of the Duke to the dim, dusty interior of the linen room, where Nora stood pinned against the shelves, visibly trembling. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable stammered, taking a hasty, unsteady step backward. She dropped into a deep, reflexive curtsy, her spine stiffening in terror. "I beg your pardon. I was under the impression the governess was trapped inside." Alistair looked down at the housekeeper. His expression was a masterpiece of aristocratic boredom and mild, dangerous irritation. He adjusted the cuff of his crisp white shirt, the picture of a man casually interrupted during a mundane household inspection. "The latch is entirely seized, Mrs. Gable," Alistair said. His voice was a slow, resonant drawl that echoed down the empty corridor. "I found Miss Hayes attempting to pry it open from the inside. It took considerable force to break it free. It is unacceptable that the hardware in this wing has been allowed to rust to the point of trapping the staff." Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered to the latch, then to Nora. The housekeeper was a shrewd woman. She smelled the lie. She could smell the brandy on the Duke's breath and the sheer, vibrating terror radiating from the governess. But Alistair had handed her a plausible narrative, wrapped in a reprimand. To question it was to accuse a peer of the realm of locking himself in a closet with a servant. It was social suicide for a woman of her station. "I will have the smith see to it immediately, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping to a low, tight whisper. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on Alistair's boots. "My deepest apologies for the disturbance." "See that it is done by evening," Alistair commanded. He did not look back at Nora. He stepped out into the corridor, bypassing the housekeeper without another word, his long strides carrying him toward the grand staircase. Nora remained frozen against the shelves. The stench of dried lavender was making her physically nauseous. Mrs. Gable slowly straightened. The housekeeper stepped into the doorway, blocking the exit. She looked at the fallen pillowcases on the floor, then slowly raised her gaze to meet Nora's. The mask of subservience was gone, replaced by a cold, glittering malice. "Pick those up, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Gable hissed, her voice barely louder than a breath. "And ensure you wash your hands before you touch them again. The filth on them is palpable." Nora's jaw ached from clenching it. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She dropped to her knees on the dusty floorboards, her coarse wool skirt pooling around her, and began gathering the pristine white linen. Her hands shook so violently she could barely fold the fabric. She was acutely aware of Mrs. Gable watching her, analyzing the flush on her neck, the frantic pulse beating at her throat. When Nora finally emerged from the room, Mrs. Gable stepped aside, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. A seized latch. How very fortunate His Grace was passing by. Nora walked away without a word. She kept her spine perfectly straight until she reached the servants' stairwell. The moment she was out of sight, she collapsed against the cold stone wall of the landing, pressing her face into her hands. A dry, wretched sob tore its way up her throat. She had survived by a fraction of an inch. That night, the attic felt smaller than ever. The frost on the window pane was thick, obscuring the moonlight. Nora did not sit on the edge of the bed and wait for footsteps. She pulled her battered leather trunk from beneath the iron frame. The brass clasps were tarnished and stiff. She forced them open, the metallic snap sharp in the quiet room. She began to pack. It was a meager, pathetic collection of a life. 3 severe wool dresses, 2 linen night shifts, a worn copy of a botanical encyclopedia she had purchased second-hand years ago, a pair of sturdy, scuffed boots. She opened the small, knotted handkerchief hidden in the lining of the trunk. 7 shillings, 4 pence. It was not enough to secure a boarding house in London. It was barely enough for third-class train fare to the city. If she left tomorrow, she would arrive with nothing, no references, and no prospects. She would likely end up scrubbing grates in a workhouse before the month was out. Nora sat on the freezing floorboards, the coins cutting into her palm. She closed her eyes, remembering the searing heat of Alistair's hand against her jaw, the desperate, hollow sound of his confession. "Do you think I feel like a duke when I'm shivering in your bed?" She loved him. The realization did not bloom like a flower. It struck her like a physical blow to the ribs, sharp and crippling. She loved a man who was using her to survive his own ruin, a man who could destroy her life without even intending to. And because she loved him, and because she was not a fool, she knew she had to leave. The smell of wet chalk and old coal smoke in the nursery the next morning made Nora's stomach churn. She stood by the window, watching the groundskeeper hack at the frozen earth near the rose bushes. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray, promising snow. She had not slept. Her eyes burned, her skin feeling paper-thin and fragile. Her packed trunk remained locked beneath her bed, waiting for her to gather the courage to inform the steward of her immediate departure. "Miss Hayes," Nora turned from the glass. Penelope was sitting at her small desk. The child had not touched her slate. Instead, she was staring at Nora with an unnerving, unblinking intensity. The 8-year-old possessed a quiet vigilance that adults often mistook for dullness. Penelope noticed the tightened jaw, the hollowed eyes, the severe, unforgiving way Nora had pinned her hair this morning. "Yes, Penelope?" Nora asked, her voice lacking its usual crisp authority. It sounded brittle, ready to snap. Penelope picked up her chalk. She did not draw a house with barred doors. She carefully, laboriously wrote 4 words in jagged, uneven print. She pushed the slate across the wooden table. "You are going away." It wasn't a question. Nora stared at the white dust against the dark slate. The crushing weight of guilt pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. She walked over to the table and crouched beside the child's chair, putting herself at eye level. She did not wipe the slate clean. "I cannot stay here, Penelope," Nora said softly. It was the first time she had spoken to the girl not as a governess commanding a pupil, but as one human being to another. Penelope's pale eyes filled with immediate, silent tears. They spilled over her lashes, trekking quickly down her pale cheeks. She didn't sob. She simply cried with the silent, practiced grief of a child who had already learned that crying aloud changed nothing. She reached out, her small, ink-stained fingers grabbing a fistful of Nora's coarse brown skirt, holding on with white-knuckled desperation. Nora's breath hitched. She wrapped her own hand over Penelope's, her thumb rubbing the small, trembling knuckles. "You are strong. You are much stronger than this house, and you are stronger than the silence. Do you understand me? You must speak to him. He is lost, but he is your father." The heavy nursery door swung open without a knock. Alistair stepped inside. He stopped dead, taking in the scene. The weeping child clutching the governess's skirt, and Nora kneeling on the floor, her own face pale and drawn. The dark shadows under his eyes were prominent today, his face locked in a severe, unreadable mask. "What has happened here?" Alistair demanded, his voice slicing through the quiet room. Nora stood up slowly, gently prying Penelope's fingers from her skirt. She smoothed the fabric, her hands trembling. She kept her eyes trained on the middle button of Alistair's waistcoat. "Penelope is merely fatigued, Your Grace. The history lesson was taxing." "Leave us," Alistair said. The command was directed at the child. Penelope sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her sleeve. She slid out of her chair, giving Nora one last devastating look before darting out of the nursery, leaving the heavy door ajar. Alistair crossed the room and kicked the door shut. The sound was a harsh crack. He turned to face Nora, the polite distance he normally maintained evaporating entirely. "You did not unlock your door last night," he stated. It was a flat, ugly accusation. "No, Your Grace, I did not." Nora stepped behind the instructional desk, putting a physical barrier between them. She needed the wood to anchor her. "And I will not unlock it tonight or any night hereafter." Alistair stared at her, a muscle jumping violently in his jaw. The anger in him was palpable, a dark, churning thing beneath his impeccably tailored clothes. "Because of Mrs. Gable, because of a seized latch, because I am leaving," Nora said. The words tore out of her throat, ragged and final. "I'm submitting my notice to your steward this afternoon. I will be on the morning train to London." The silence that followed was absolute. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, a heavy rhythmic thud that marked the seconds of his shock. Alistair's posture rigidified, his broad shoulders tensing until the wool of his coat strained. "You have no references," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. He walked slowly toward the desk. "You have no family. I know exactly what you are paid, Miss Hayes. You do not have the funds to secure a life in the city. You will starve." "Then I will starve," Nora countered, lifting her chin. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, desperate pride. "I prefer starvation to the terror of waiting for Mrs. Gable to find a misplaced hairpin or a dusty footprint, and having my reputation destroyed while you offer plausible excuses and walk away." Alistair slammed both hands down on the desktop. The inkwell rattled ominously. He leaned over the wood, his face inches from hers. He smelled of cold air and bitter coffee. "I protected you yesterday," he hissed, his eyes feral, stripping away the Duke, leaving only the starving man. "You protected yourself," Nora shouted back, the volume of her own voice shocking her. She didn't care who heard. "You protected your title. If she had opened that door, you would have faced an uncomfortable afternoon with your peers. I would have been thrown out into the snow with nothing. Do not dare call that protection." Alistair flinched as if she had struck him. He slowly pushed himself off the desk, his hands dragging through his dark hair, a gesture of complete, uncharacteristic defeat. He turned his back to her, staring blankly at the wall map of the British Empire. "I cannot let you go," he said. The anger was gone, replaced by a bleak, hollow despair. "The house. The silence will kill me, Nora. It is already killing Penelope. I cannot cure your grief, Alistair, she whispered, her anger dissolving into that same heavy, suffocating ache. I'm only a governess. I'm a bandage on a wound that requires stitching. If you want to survive, you have to look at your daughter, not at me in the dark. He turned back to her. His eyes were wide, desperate, entirely stripped of their aristocratic armor. Then do not be the governess. I have a cottage on the southern edge of the estate. It is secluded, stone-built, warm. I will furnish it. I will provide a stipend that guarantees you will never worry about a boarding house or a rusted trunk again. Nora froze. The offer hung in the dusty air, heavy and toxic. He was offering her security. He was offering her comfort. He was offering to make her his hidden mistress. The insult burned hot and bright in her chest, a corrosive acid that ate away the last lingering thread of her affection. She looked at the man she loved, realizing he truly did not understand the difference between survival and dignity. I am a worker, Your Grace, Nora said, her voice dropping to a dead, emotionless flatline. I am not a whore. My notice will be on your steward's desk by 3. The leather of the trunk handle bit into her palm. It was heavy, packed with nothing but cheap wool and a stubborn, bleeding pride. Nora dragged it down the 3 flights of narrow, unlit servant stairs. Each step was a jarring jolt to her shoulder socket. She had delivered her folded notice to the estate steward, Mr. Finch, who handed over her remaining wages, 6 shillings and 4 pence, with a disinterested sniff. No one offered to help. As Nora reached the ground floor, Mrs. Gable stood at the intersection of the kitchens and the scullery corridor, her knobby hands folded primly over her starched black apron. The cruel, vindicated satisfaction radiating from her rigid posture was unmistakable. "Leave the keys on the hook, Miss Hayes," the housekeeper instructed, her voice echoing harshly off the damp flagstones. Nora unclipped the heavy brass ring and dropped it onto the iron hook. The loud, metallic jangle signaled the absolute end of her tenure. She pushed open the heavy oak service door with her shoulder and stepped out into the biting winter afternoon. The cold hit her lungs like swallowed glass. The bruised gray sky had finally broken, spitting hard, granular flakes of snow that stung her cheeks like flying sand. The gravel of the long drive crunched aggressively beneath her scuffed boots. She had 2 miles to walk to the village station. She didn't look back at Rothmere Hall. Looking back was a luxury for people who had a safety net. She focused purely on the mechanics of walking, right foot, left foot, the agonizing drag of the trunk, the burn in her shoulder. The wind howled across the open estate, whipping her drab brown skirt around her legs. She made it half a mile before she heard it, not the rhythmic clatter of a carriage, but the frantic, heavy impact of boots running on gravel. Nora stopped, her chest heaving, and turned. Alistair was 100 yards away, sprinting through the driving snow. He wore no overcoat, no hat, no gloves, only dark trousers and a white linen shirt, the collar undone, the sleeves pushed aggressively up to his elbows. Snow melted against the broad heat of his shoulders. Stripped of the terrifying polish of his title, he looked feral, a man drowning who had finally decided to fight the current. He closed the distance, stopping 3 feet from her, fighting for oxygen in the freezing air, his knuckles red and raw. "You!" he gasped, bracing his large hands on his knees. "You walk too fast." Nora's grip on the trunk handle tightened until her joints ached. "You should go back inside, Your Grace. You will catch a chill." Alistair straightened. He looked at her face, his pale slate eyes burning with a desperate, frantic clarity. "I went to the nursery," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp over the wind. "To find Penelope." Nora's stomach clenched. "Is she all right?" "She spoke to me." Alistair stepped closer. "She threw a wooden alphabet block at my head and told me I was a coward. She's 8 years old, and she possesses more courage than I have mustered in a year. She's right. I am a coward. I have been hiding behind my dead ancestors, expecting you to bear the crushing weight so I didn't have to. Alistair, please, Nora whispered. The raw honesty was breaking down the iron walls she had spent hours reinforcing. He stepped forward, kicking the leather trunk out of the way. He grabbed her frozen face with both bare hands. His palms were boiling hot against her icy skin. I do not want a mistress in a cottage, he said fiercely, his thumbs smearing melting snow across her cheekbones. I was terrified of the scandal, of losing my respectability, but standing out here, none of it matters. The title means absolutely nothing if the house is a tomb. The house will ruin us, she argued, though she leaned into his burning hands. Then we leave it. We board the windows. We take Penelope and go to London. I do not care. He pressed his forehead against hers. Marry me. The words hung in the frigid air, massive and impossible. You are a duke, Nora breathed, and you are the only human being who makes me feel alive, he answered. I will fire Mrs. Gable the moment we walk through those doors. Let the House of Lords gossip until their throats bleed. But do not leave me in the silence, please. He didn't demand. He begged. It was the complete surrender of his pride, laid bare in the winter storm. Nora tasted the salt of her own tears mixing with the weather. She brought her numb, gloved hands up, resting them against his racing heart beneath the damp linen. You will freeze to death before we reach the doors, she whispered. A fierce, jagged smile broke across Alistair's face. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Then you will just have to keep me warm. He released her, bent down, and hoisted her heavy leather trunk onto his own shoulder. Nora watched the Duke of Rothmere haul cheap servants' luggage through a blizzard, the tension in her spine finally unraveling. She fell into step beside him. As they approached the main carved entry, the footman scrambled to throw the doors open. His eyes bulged at his master drenched in snow, the governess by his side. Alistair strode into the grand foyer, leaving muddy tracks across the priceless Persian rug. He dropped the luggage with a resounding crash. Thomas, Alistair barked, his voice ringing with a new dangerous authority. Summon Mrs. Gable. Tell her to pack her bags. Nora stood in the center of the foyer, the ice melting from her lashes. The house was no longer silent. The walls of Rothmere Hall couldn't hold back the truth forever. Nora and Alistair proved that real love doesn't hide in the shadows. It demands to be brought into the light, flaws, mud, and all. Their raw, messy fight for survival turned into a fierce fight for each other. If this deeply human romance kept you hooked until the very last muddy footprint on that Persian rug, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who crave authentic historical drama, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more grounded, emotional storytelling. See you next time.